I spoke to you of strategic foresight, which is not the art of predicting the future. It is the art of imagining potential futures. It's also the art of seeing the shape of history, not only how things change over time, the patterns of how they change. Now, one of the patterns we look for are eras. In any area of endeavor, museology, education, manufacturing, travel, we will go through eras, each of which is marked by a dominant technology. And by technology, it could be a mechanical technology, it could be an invention, it could be a philosophy, it could be a way of approaching work. And as we go through that era, we go through a period of slow adaptation as the new dominant technology is developed and explored and exploited. And then at some point, things take off. People really get the hang of this new technology. And they find all the ways to use it creatively and adaptively to fuel their work. But then after things have been zooming along, at some point, it peters out. We've maxed out the potential of that invention, and we have to find a new innovation to drive a new era. So for example, the eras of leisure travel. We're just coming off of a leisure travel era dominated by air travel. And, as I said, there was a period of fermentation. When the Wright brothers first flew their plane in Kitty Hawk, I'm sure nobody was sitting there saying, damn, that's going to be a great way to get to California. It was a new technology. It was something for adventurers, for explorers. But very quickly, it was exploited and adapted to be something that people could use for business travel. As a matter of fact, it was an enjoyable luxury. You'd dress up in your Sunday best to get on an airplane and sit down and be served fine food with linens in China. You could get on the supersonic jet. In only a couple of hours, you could reach Europe. That was the era of taking off, if you'll excuse the pun, when we were exploiting air travel for all it was worth. Now I would argue we've reached the stage of stagnation. I don't know anybody who's not flying business class, who would describe it as a luxury now. We think of it as an inconvenience and an irritation. I don't know what the next era of leisure travel will be, but I hope it comes soon. So let's think about this with regard to education. Educational eras. I'm going to make the argument that we're coming off the end of one educational era, and it's our job as museum workers and as futurists to foresee what the next era will be and what role museums can play. Now, the last era, the 20th century, was sometimes been characterized as the era of manufactured learning. As people use the analogy of Henry Ford figuring out how to churn out Model Ts on the assembly line, we figured out how to churn out students by grouping them by age and putting them in a class and having a teacher talk to them with a standard curriculum and testing them to see if they'd achieved enough to go on to the next stage in the assembly line and on and on and on until they pop out at the end, fitted to either work in their own factory or to go on for higher education. More kindly, this has sometimes been called the teacher-centered era. And it really didn't change all that much in the essentials of that philosophy over the course of the whole century. If you go to the mid-century, you still are taking kids, bundling them by age, sitting them in a classroom, a teacher's getting out and presenting the material. They show they've mastered it, and sometimes even if they don't show they master it, they get graduated to the next class. Even at the very beginning of this century, it's the same thing. So we've layered on the technology of computers, so what? It's just another way of delivering the information. The dominant philosophy is the same. It's about a standardized set of knowledge delivered from an expert to the audience with testing, standardized testing, around a very narrow curriculum being the way to determine success. I'm arguing, and notice where I've put this on my curve, that this is an era that has reached stagnation. We are at the point where we're putting tremendous amounts of effort into making this system work better, and nothing's happening. We're devoting billions of dollars, lots of attention from our legislators, from our educational reformers, from our policymakers, from our funders to trying to make this system work, and we have not made substantial progress in 40 years. That points to the fact that we may be ready to make the leap to a new educational era. But what will that era look like? What will be the dominant educational philosophy guiding the 21st century? We don't know. We don't know. But that means it's open to be influenced. This is something we can have an effect on. We're beginning to see hints of what it might be like, because when you talk to experts in education, when you talk to people who spend their time thinking about the new skills needed for the 21st century workspace, you begin to hear common threads. You hear that children should be learning creativity. You hear that they should be learning collaboration. You hear that they should be learning critical thinking. Now, wait a minute. That sounds an awful lot like the kind of learning that museums teach, doesn't it? That sounds a lot like the self-directed, immersive, passion-based learning that we're really good at. If that's true, if we're entering a 21st century where the dominant philosophy of education is based around these skills, we as museums could have an awful lot to offer that new century. So let's explore a little bit the forces that are destabilizing that last era of education and think about the forces that are shaping the next era, so we can see what we're dealing with and so we can see where we might have an opportunity for influence. Two major kinds of forces shape the future. The first is trends. Trends are things that change over time. Slow or fast, up or down. They're things that progress day to day, week to week, year to year, and like water wearing away the side of a canyon can create huge change. Grand Canyon, created by the trend of water eroding through the rock. What are these slow forces shaping education now? One trend is dissatisfaction with the system. By all measures, if you're looking at overt measures like performance, these are some statistics about how we stack up globally. We're 11th globally in 4th grade math, 9th and 8th grade math, 7th and 4th grade science, 10th and 8th grade science. That's not even showing the English scores. Trying as hard as we can, we're barely in the middle of the pack. You can see it in the reaction to the reforms we've tried to make. No Child Left Behind. People are making jokes about it. Rather than being a stellar success that has lifted us out of the darkness of educational mediocrity, it's become something that people mock. It can be seen in some of the backlash we have. One of the things teachers are doing to try and help their students pass those tests is giving them more and more homework. And parents are saying, wait, when do they have a chance to be kids? It's important for kids to have free time, downtime, unstructured time, to learn what to do with themselves, to be self-directed, to get out there and play. So, first trend, dissatisfaction with the existing system. The second trend, being in a capitalist society, if there's a business opportunity, companies will jump in to take it. And it is clear there is a business opportunity to try and create a viable alternative to the old public school education model, because there are companies all over the place jumping in to take advantage of it. The charter school movement is huge, because people are so willing to try something else because of their dissatisfaction with the public school system that they're standing in line, literally, for hours in the dark to try and get into charter schools. And a lot of charter schools are experimenting with the system to see what they can make work better. Now, mind you, they're still experimenting for the most part around the old educational philosophy, and the jury's out as to whether they're making it work in any significantly better way. Then there are the people who throw up their hands and opt out entirely. Homeschooling. Homeschooling, relatively speaking, is a pretty important trend. I'm not saying that it's a huge percentage of kids in the country. It's not. But in the period between 1999 and 2003, the number of kids being homeschooled, K through 12, practically doubled. In 2007, it was up to about 3% of the school-age population. The best guesstimates I've seen now is it might be up to 5%. Is that a small percentage? Yes, but it's growing rapidly, and it's showing that for some percentage of kids, there's a good kind of schooling that can be provided outside of the formal school environment using available resources, whether it's online education, whether it's using museum programs, whether it's using school curriculum applied in the home. Then to look at the really fringe trend, how many of you have heard of unschooling? Unschooling is beyond homeschooling. It's not the parent being the teacher, it's the parent saying, what are you interested? Okay, here's some resources, go at it. It's letting a kid really be a self-directed learner, to take the bull by the horns and say, I want to go do this, I'm going to learn this online, I'm going to go take that program, I'm going to run my own life. I'm not saying it's for everyone, but I have met some incredibly bright, unschooled people who are actually working in museums now who have done very well with that model. I'm going to be talking today about the whole continuum of education because it really is a continuum. We've just chunked it up into sort of artificial bits. K through 12, college education, postgraduate, moving on to work where we have to be lifelong learners. I'm going to focus mostly on K through 12, but I want to look at the other end of the educational spectrum because it sheds light on how K through 12 is or isn't working. Right now, we can see college is not a winning proposition. We have rising student debt. On average, the current college graduate comes out with $25,000 in debt. For the first 3 years out of school, over half of the new graduates are underemployed or unemployed. And when I say underemployed, I mean working in Starbucks for minimum wage. This is not a successful model. They're getting out of school and saying, how am I going to pay back my student loans? And there's no obvious answer. So college may be a bad return on investment. And at the same time, we're beginning to see alternatives. We're beginning to see methods of people assembling their own personal learning platforms, saying, I'm going to take some online courses over here. I'm going to take a little local college community course there. I'm going to take an exam here that I can get credit for. I'm going to go do an apprenticeship. I'm going to build a portfolio of work. I was just reading in the Times this morning online a story about a college in New Jersey that grants credits and degrees based on these kinds of assemblages that a student can bring to them and say, I should be able to get a degree from you. Let me prove I did the work. Some of their graduates have never been on campus. We're beginning to see an acceptance of alternate forms of credentialing, micro-credentialing, valid means of recognizing these little pieces of learning that collectively build up to being an education. Some of it, as I mentioned before with the veterans, is digital badges, ways of having online validation that lets an employer say, what did you do? Let me drill in and see what that coursework was or what that project was. What was the assessment? How was it evaluated? As soon as we have a robust and widely accepted method of recognizing, credentialing, validating a diverse set of learning experiences, that sound you hear is going to be the ivory tower cracking. And that's where this kind of online recognition really takes off. The resume of the future may not be, I graduated from this college with this GPA cum laude, and then I got this graduate degree from another college. It may be, here's my suite of digital badges. It shows you all these different courses I took, all this different experience I had, and collectively it shows you I'm a skilled and experienced person that you might hire. Disruptive trends, all of them pushing us in a different direction. The next kind of force that shapes the future is events. If trends are the quotidian, everyday things a little bit different, disruptive events are the newspaper headlines. It's when you wake up and you read the Times and you say, wow, now I'm living in a different world. Or you wake up 10 years later and you say, I should have known it was a different world when I read that headline 10 years ago. So disruptive events are game changers. They're things that disrupt the even course of the future and send it caroming off into a completely different direction. What are some of the disruptive events we've had in education in the past few decades? I would argue that one was the report issued under President Reagan, A Nation at Risk, 1983. This is one of the major events marking the direction we're going in now, with this focus on Common Core standards, standardized testing, drilling kids on a narrow base of knowledge. No Child Left Behind, another notable event in the history of education, and that represented a doubling down on this educational strategy. Do more of it. Try it harder. If it's not working, it's because we're not putting enough effort into it. But not all the events that have happened are reinforcing this trend. Some are challenging them. So for example, 2011, the Mozilla Foundation and Hashtag, with funding from the Gates Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation, announced that that year's digital media and learning competition would be devoted to badges for lifelong learning. And the launch of this competition is the event where Secretary of Education Arne Duncan gave that speech where he said that digital badges have the potential to transform learning in America. So this is a bunch of major players, the Gates Foundation, the Department of Education, Mozilla, are putting real resources behind developing an alternate way to credential education. This is massive. The problem is that's seeing them in hindsight. That's the waking up 10 years later and saying, wow, that was the point where history may be changed. How do we think forward and see disruptive events before they happen so we can be ready for them? This is where your imagination comes in. I made up a couple of potentially plausible disruptive events that I'll share with you, and you'll be seeing that one of the pieces of homework you've got to do at your tables after I finish speaking is to make up other potential headlines of the future. So I was thinking, future of education, what are a couple of things that I could wake up and read in the newspaper and say, wow, that made a difference? The first one goes back to those online education models that I mentioned. Coursera, Udacity, edX. They're great. They haven't figured out how they're going to make any money. It's like Facebook going out there and getting millions of users and figuring eventually they'll find a financial model, but if they do, it's going to clean up. Okay, so here's my first headline, Coursera. I wake up in a year and I read Coursera announces first quarter profits for the first time, will announce its initial public offering. This is enormous. As soon as a provider of massive open online courses figure out a way to make money from it, they're going to take over the market. They don't completely replace the physical experience of going to college, but for tens of thousands of students, they're going to be the more affordable alternative. Second headline of the future. IBM releases guidelines for job applicants to submit digital badges instead of a traditional resume. Okay, that's a long headline. If I were a real newspaper person, I would have figured out a way to say it shorter. The big barrier right now to adaptation and adoption of these alternate forms of micro-credentialing is showing that employers will accept them. IBM is one of the biggest employers in the US. If they officially say, we don't care if you went to college, if you show us a digital resume that validates your experience, the courses you took, the apprenticeships you did, the actual work you went out and started yourself, and we're going to give that just as much weight as somebody with a traditional college course, the old resume is dead. Another transformative potential event that I think could happen in the next 5 years. Okay, so we've done a whirlwind look at some of the trends shaping the future, some of the disruptive events that could throw it off course. Where does that take us? It takes us to the principal goal of strategic foresight, which is imagining those different futures we could end up in so that we can be prepared, first of all, to choose the ones we want to live in and think what we could do today to make sure that's the future we end up in, to imagine the ones we really don't like and think what can we do now to prevent them, and in any case, to be prepared to adapt to what happens so that we haven't put all of our strategic planning eggs in one basket. This is us today, dealing with our children, dealing with our grandchildren, saying this is what it's like to go to school. Our job as futurists is to spend some time looking forward and saying, what could that look like in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years? There isn't one answer. There are many, infinite numbers of potential futures out there in what futurists call the cone of plausibility. We're going to look at two today. Two scenarios, two little short stories of the future that I'm going to tell you very briefly and hope you can fill in with your imagination. The first is called a Vibrant Learning Grid, and full credit to the KnowledgeWorks Foundation in Cincinnati, Ohio. This is adapted from their 2020 forecast, Creating the Future of Education. So let's look at a Vibrant Learning Grid. In this scenario, we live in a future where people have taken control of their educational resources and taken it out to the community to say, our kids can be best served by individual learning plans created for that child specifically. Rather than just hiring teachers who work in schools, the government is funding learning mentors, each of whom works with a number of children to design individualized curriculum, some of it mediated by digital learning, some of it in place in the community. And any given child could be picking up pieces of their education from all sorts of places. Some of it might be online. Some of it might be going to a local school to do a class with cohorts who may or may not be the same age as them. In the afternoon, they might trot off to the public library and use the local hackerspace or makerspace to try making things out and learn principles of engineering. Later in the afternoon, they might go to the museum and do an art education class. And then in the evening, maybe they'll be working online on their own project, creating a website where they're curating their own virtual museum. This is a future of education that was really shaped by individual choice, distributed resources, and one in which the entire community is seen as the place where kids learn. Kids don't go to school. School is one place they could get part of their education. The whole community is filled with different resources they access to round out their educational profile. In this future, you can see where museums would play a distinct and central role. Our educational resources are so rich and so deep. We're so good at inspiring this kind of self-directed, passion-based learning. We would be fabulous learning mentors. A lot of the people who are paid to guide children in their education might, in fact, be based in museums. Would this be utopia? I don't know. But it's certainly plausible. There's a saying about future studies that the future already is here, it's just unequally distributed, which is one way of saying if you go to California, you can see what's going to happen to the rest of the country in 20 years. What it really means is that any plausible future has a toehold in the present. If something could happen in the future, it's happening a little bit right now. One of the reasons I think that this scenario is plausible is I can see little pieces of it happening now. If I look at museums, I see, for example, the DeCordova Sculpture Park and Museum. Is anybody there from the DeCordova here? Well, shout out to you in case you're in the virtual audience, which has taken the Lincoln preschool and brought it into the museum. So now these kids, these preschoolers, attend preschool in a museum. Why not? What a great way to be raised in a rich visual literacy environment. I see the Hirshhorn's Art Lab Plus, which is a media lab that welcomes teens, many of them from at-risk school districts now, to come in and use a whole suite of resources, technological, human, to design their own projects and execute them. So this is self-directed, passion-based learning with a vengeance in a museum environment where the kids know that they're doing real work because what they produce is integrated into what the museum offers the public. I see the National Building Museum here in DC with its Building Bridges program, which lets kids use principles of engineering to teach exactly those 21st century skills of creativity, collaboration, critical thinking, as they experiment with how to build a bridge. I see the Henry Ford, and I think we have someone from the Henry Ford Museum here. Hi, George. Which uses its Innovation 101 curriculum to vastly scale up its educational impact. So this is a modular digital education curriculum that tells the stories of current innovators through oral histories and interviews with people like Steve Wozniak. And it takes the histories of historic innovators like Edison and Ford, and it uses it to spark creativity and create a culture of innovation. And because they're doing this in a way that's scalable to reach thousands of kids, not just ones who can come to the museum, it has the potential to have a significant impact on American education. So these are all ways right now that museums are doing little bits of that future, of creating distributed resources that kids can use to build their own educational system. All right, that's a vibrant learning grid. As I said, it might not be utopia. I can certainly imagine that in a system like this, some kids would fall between the cracks. Their parents, or they might not have the oomph to get up and figure out what the learning platform for that kid should be. There might be kids who need a much more structured environment. But then again, there are kids who aren't thriving in the current system. So, do you think that's a plausible future? And do you think it's one we would want to create? There are other potential futures. The other one that I've created for us to look at, I call a fractured landscape. And this is really where I think we might end up if we go exactly in the direction we're going. If it's more of the same, if not only do we double down on this philosophy of core curriculum standards, focusing on the test, but if we triple down on it, we're going to end up with a society where we have an unequal distribution of education the way we currently have an unequal distribution of wealth. We're going to have a narrow focus on the test. We're going to have the A gutted out of steam. The arts are not going to be recognized as a valuable part of real life skills. We're going to have schools who are increasingly strapped for funding, cutting everything they can. They're certainly going to cut arts education, even though we're dealing with an obesity crisis for our children. That's not what the schools are going to get measured on, so they're going to cut that out in the favor of more time for study, no more phys ed. And the way that those rich online resources are going to be used is to substitute for the librarian who can help kids find and love books. In this future, kids are going to be tested at an earlier age. But the people who have the resources to do so are going to be able to create a richer and more vibrant culture of education for their kids. So that 1% with the most resources in the US and the other 9% who are doing pretty well are going to be able to pay for private tutors to make sure that their kids can get into the best programs, can get into the gifted and talented programs. They're going to make sure that their kids have access to museums, which are now going to be luxuries. In this future, we are the add-ons. We're the nice, not necessary. We're the frosting on the cake. We're the place where kids go if they go to a school that can afford the time and money for buses to take field trips, or whose parents are going to take them to a museum after school outside the curriculum. Two futures of education. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to apply your critical thinking to which you think we might and should end up in. You have an assignment sheet in front of you, and I'm going to start you off on part of it before we leave you on your own to work. At the bottom, you'll see I asked 3 questions, and I'm going to get you started by asking the first 2 for the whole group. So we're going to ask this of the room, and we also have a poll for the virtual audience. The first question I have for you is, which of these futures do you prefer? So how many of you prefer a vibrant learning grid? Show of hands. How many of you prefer a fractured landscape? Ooh, I don't see anyone. Okay, you might think, why did you even bother asking? You set that up. Of course I set it up. The reason I asked it is because I'm also setting up the next question, which is, which of these do you feel is most likely? So which of these futures do you think is more probable to happen if you were betting money on it? So how many of you think the more probable future is a vibrant learning grid? Oh God, you guys are even more pessimists than I thought. 2 hands, yay! How many of you think a fractured landscape is more probable? Look around. Keep your hands up and look around. This is your window for advocacy. There's a complete disconnect between the future you said you preferred and the future you think is likely. This is your call to action. Where can you do something today, tomorrow, next week, next year, either as a private individual or in your museum, to make sure that if this is the future you prefer, that we're knocked out of this path and over to this one? That is your question for discussion at your tables for the next 15 minutes or so. What is something that you could do? And it might be tomorrow when you're up on the hill. What is something you could do that makes it more likely we will live in a vibrant learning landscape? What is something your museum could do? I also have given you one other assignment, because it's fun, which is to write your own headline of the future. So the top part of your sheet is a place where you can write your own headline for the New York Times. And yes, you can tell them you own copyright. If you end up writing a really cool headline, I hope you share it with everyone on the way out. We've actually put up a place outside the room where you can tape them up. And I'm going to be taking them back to the office so I can read them and blog about them. I'm going to leave you now for about 15 minutes to work at your tables on your own with your discussion question and your headlines while I run back to work with the virtual audience. So I'll see you in 15 minutes.